Dean Martin broke down after hearing about his son's passing. His response will touch your heart. It was a moment no parent should ever face. Dean Martin, the legendary crooner, received the heartbreaking news that his son had passed away unexpectedly. But what followed next shocked everyone around him. In a moment of raw emotion, Dean did something no one expected. Where are you watching from? Let us know in the comments. Dean Martin had it all: fame, fortune, and a voice that could melt hearts. But behind the glitz and glamour of Hollywood, there was a side to Dean that few knew. Despite being a star, he struggled with his personal life. His relationship with his children, particularly his son Dean Jr., was filled with complexities. The father-son bond was strong, but it wasn't without tension. There had been periods of distance, missed opportunities, and unspoken words between them. Dean's fame had often kept him away from his family, and the time lost couldn't be recovered. Yet, no matter the strain, Dean's love for his son remained constant. His world was built around his music, his career, but in the deepest parts of his heart, it was his family that held the most significance. Dean Jr.'s passing was not just the loss of a child. It was the loss of a future. The legacy he had hoped to share with his son was ripped away in an instant, leaving Dean reeling from the void. The public would soon know of the tragedy, but no one could truly understand the pain he was enduring in that moment. The phone call came at the worst possible time. Dean had just wrapped up a rehearsal for a show, still riding the high of the day. He sat in his private study, flipping through some papers, when his agent called. The voice on the other end was shaking, filled with a grim sort of urgency. "Dean, it's Dean Jr., the agent said, his words faltering. "He's gone. There was a car accident." Dean froze. It felt like the world stopped moving. The air left his lungs. For a moment, he couldn't process the words. His son, his flesh and blood, the one person who had always looked up to him, was gone. He dropped the phone, his hands trembling, his knees buckling beneath him. The sadness that followed was a crushing wave, pulling him under Tontiuo. The life he had known, the music, the fame, the applause, seemed so distant, so insignificant in the face of this unimaginable loss. It wasn't just grief, it was guilt. The regret of not being there enough, of not having more time. Dean Martin was a star. But in that moment, he was just a father who had lost his son. Dean Martin had navigated the rough seas of fame for decades. He had weathered storms in the public eye, survived scandals, and overcome personal hardships. But nothing had prepared him for this. The loss of his son wasn't just a private tragedy, it was public. The world, which had always looked up to him as a smooth, untouchable legend, was about to witness the raw, vulnerable side of Dean Martin. His pain would be on display for everyone to see. In that moment, he felt the crushing weight of being a public figure. The expectation to be stronger, to remain composed, felt suffocating. The cameras, the media, the press, they all wanted a reaction. What they didn't understand was that Dean's grief couldn't be measured in sound bites. It wasn't something that could be reduced to a headline. Behind the well-groomed hair, the perfectly tailored suit, and the rehearsed smile, Dean was simply a father who had lost his son. He didn't know how to be anything other than himself in that moment. His mind raced as he sat in silence, overwhelmed by the immensity of what he had just heard. In the days that followed, Dean's grief became a quiet, suffocating presence. He didn't want to face the cameras or the press. The public expected him to show up, to perform, to be the star they adored. But inside, he was broken. He had always been in control, maintaining a facade of perfect composure for his fans and family. But now, there was no control. He felt like he was losing himself. The pain of losing Dean Jr. was unbearable, but the weight of the public's gaze was just as intense. Everywhere he went, People were watching, waiting for his next move. The whispers, begging. What would Dean do now? How would he react? People wanted a show, but Dean had nothing to give them. He was struggling to even breathe. The memories of his son flooded his mind. Laughter, shared moments, the bond they had built over the years. They were fleeting now, replaced by an emptiness that seemed impossible to fill. He retreated into the solace of his home, away from the eyes of the world, but even then, the grief followed him, relentless and heavy. Dean Martin was no stranger to hardship. Raised in the working-class neighborhoods of Steubenville, Ohio, he had fought tooth and nail to get to where he was. He wasn't born with silver spoons or in the lap of luxury. His rise to fame was a result of talent, resilience, and relentless perseverance. The world knew him as a smooth entertainer with effortless charm, but very few understood the internal battles he faced. His career had cost him time with his family, with his children, especially with Dean Jr. in his quieter moments. Dean often reflected on this. He had spent so much time perfecting his craft, building his empire, that he had neglected the most important thing, the people who mattered most. Now, as he sat in the stillness of his grief, it wasn't just the loss of his son that weighed on him, but the lost time, the missed moments. Could he have done more? Should he have been there more for his son? Dean knew this wasn't just a public challenge, it was a personal reckoning. A man who had lived his life in the spotlight now had to face the darkness of his own emotions. Dean's life was built on the foundation of control. From his immaculate stage performances to his carefully curated public persona, he was a man who had mastered the art of being in charge. But the loss of his son tore at the fabric of that control. For the first time, Dean found himself adrift. His world, once so meticulously structured, had unraveled in an instant. The strength he had relied on for so many years now seemed fragile in the face of grief. But despite the overwhelming sorrow, there was a flicker of determination within him. Dean Martin had always been a survivor. He had made it through the ups and downs of Hollywood, through divorces and personal turmoil. But now, he had to face something that no amount of fame or wealth could shield him from. This was the ultimate test. He would have to summon a new kind of strength. The strength to heal, to find peace, and to honor the memory of his son. Days passed, but the emotional numbness Dean felt didn't fade. Every phone call, every condolence letter, every moment in the public eye only reminded him of the hole in his heart. He had always been able to keep a stiff upper lip in the face of public scrutiny, but this was different. This was personal. This was the grief of a father who had lost his child. There was no script, no performance, no rehearsed lines to fall back on. It was just him, alone with his thoughts. The house he once filled with laughter and music now felt empty. Dean would often retreat to his study, sitting in silence as memories of his son flooded his mind. Dean Jr.'s laughter, his enthusiasm, his dreams, everything that made him who he was, had vanished. And in the quiet, Dean confronted his own vulnerability. He was still a man. He was still Dean Martin, the legend. But now, he was a father grieving the loss of the one person who had made him feel like his life had meaning beyond the spotlight. Dean knew he had to show up for the public. His fans were waiting, and the world was watching. But inside he was torn. The pressure to perform, to act like everything was fine, weighed heavily on him. He couldn't just disappear from the stage. The legacy of his career, the adoration of millions, was built on his presence, his voice, his charm. But the weight of grief was like an anchor, pulling him deeper into darkness. He went through the motions, attending events, meeting with colleagues, but the facade was cracking. In every smile, every polite handshake, every word spoken in front of the cameras, there was a moment of raw pain, hidden just beneath the surface. No one knew what he was carrying, but his true struggle wasn't being seen on the stage. It was in the silence, the moments between the lights, when he was left alone with his thoughts. Dean could still hear his son's voice echoing in his mind, asking for advice, sharing a joke. He had lost that, and the weight of it was suffocating. It wasn't long before the inevitable happened. The press, ever eager for a story, began to circle around Dean like vultures. They wanted to know how he was coping with the loss of his son. They wanted to capture his every move, his every reaction. Dean was a legend, but he was also human, and for the first time in his career, he felt cornered. The cameras were everywhere, and the reporters were relentless. They didn't care about the pain he was going through, they cared about the story. Dean found himself questioning his own decisions. Should he hide away, or should he face the world head-on? It wasn't just about his career anymore. It was about showing the world that grief wasn't something to be ashamed of, that even legends can break. As he prepared for an upcoming public event, he wondered if he was strong enough to face the public eye. Could he still perform under the weight of such sorrow? The pressure was mounting. He wasn't just mourning. He was fighting for his identity in the face of unimaginable pain. The day of the event arrived, and Dean took the stage once again. He stood before the audience, a sea of faces staring up at him, waiting for the familiar charm and wit they had come to expect. But this time, it was different. His heart wasn't in it. The applause, the cheers, they all seemed distant, almost hollow. Dean performed, but it wasn't the same. He moved mechanically, his voice carrying the weight of his sorrow, but lacking the usual spark. The crowd noticed. The energy wasn't the same. The smiles seemed forced, the jokes a little too rehearsed. But no one knew the depths of the storm that was raging inside him. Dean was a performer, a man who had made a career out of entertaining others. But today, he was just a broken man trying to keep his head above water. As he left the stage that night, Dean's heart was heavier than ever. The performance hadn't been for him, it had been for the world. He was tired of being strong for everyone else. Backstage, Dean found a quiet space. He closed his eyes and took a deep breath, trying to steady his emotions. The crowd's applause still echoed in his mind. But it wasn't the same as the joy he used to feel. The standing ovations, the cheers, they were hollow now. All he could think about was his son. His mind replayed the memories, the conversations they had shared, the moments he wished he had cherished more. The world saw a star. Dean saw a man who had lost everything. It was then that he realized the true cost of his success. Fame, wealth, and adoration were nothing compared to the love of a child. The realization hit him like a wave. He had spent so many years focused on his career, on building a legacy, that he had neglected the things that truly mattered. Dean stood there in the quiet, his chest tight with grief, understanding that no amount of applause could ever fill the void left by his son's absence. As the days went by, Dean found himself facing the inevitable public confrontation. The press conferences, the interviews, the media who wanted to know everything about his son's passing. Every question felt like a stab to his heart. He had always been the composed entertainer, the man who could charm anyone with a smile. But now Dean felt exposed. The cameras weren't just pointing at him. They were digging into his soul, looking for vulnerability, for weakness. It was a battle between what the world expected and what he was truly feeling. One morning, a reporter asked him about his son's passing. The question was blunt, but the pain in the reporter's eyes was sincere. Dean paused, his mind racing. What was he supposed to say? How could he explain the depth of his grief when even he didn't fully understand it? In that moment, Dean did something unexpected. He didn't break down. Instead, he simply said, "I loved him. That's all I need to say." His response wasn't just a statement. It was a testament to his strength, a quiet, powerful declaration that grief wasn't something to be paraded around. He didn't need the world's pity. He needed to heal in his own time, on his own terms. Dean's response to the media that day became a defining moment in his life. The press had expected tears, an outburst, or a breakdown that could fuel headlines. Instead, they got a simple, direct answer: "I loved him. That's all I need to say." The reporters, stunned by his stoic strength, were left speechless. The moment flipped the power dynamic between the celebrity and the press. For once, Dean was in control. He had refused to give them what they wanted, the spectacle of his suffering. Instead, he presented them with a raw honesty that left the media reeling. In that quiet moment, Dean Martin made it clear. He was not going to be a character in the press's narrative. His grief, his pain, his loss, those were his to handle, not theirs to exploit. The world had expected to see a broken man, but instead, they saw a man who had found strength in his vulnerability. It was a genius move, an emotional reaction that reframed the conversation and left people questioning their assumptions about grief and strength. The media buzzed for days about his response, analyzing every word, every nuance of his statement. But for Dean, the attention didn't matter. His true focus was on something much more personal. As the press conferences ended and the interviews tapered off, he found himself retreating into solitude. The public might have been satisfied with his answer, but the inner turmoil of loss still raged inside him. He began to speak more openly about Dean Jr. In the interviews that followed, sharing stories of his son's passion, his hopes, and the bond they shared. It was clear that Dean Martin, while dealing with an ocean of grief, had also found a sense of peace in honoring his son's life. He was no longer willing to let his son be defined by his death. Dean Jr. was more than just a headline. He was a person with dreams, with a future that would now live on in his father's memory. Dean started shifting the narrative, making sure the world remembered his son not for the tragic ending, but for the joy he had brought to everyone who knew him. As Jimmy went on, Dean Martin's grief didn't subside, but it began to transform. He spent more time with his family, rekindling relationships that had been strained by years of distance. His wife, Jen, was a steady presence during this time, offering him the support he desperately needed. Their marriage, though once rocky, began to heal in the wake of such profound loss. They leaned on each other, understanding that grief was something they both had to carry together. Dean began to speak more candidly about his son's death in private moments, allowing himself to cry, to reflect, and to mourn. In those quiet moments, he found healing. Dean Jr.'s memory was becoming a part of him, woven into the fabric of his everyday. Though the world had seen him as a public figure, it was in these private moments that Dean truly began to heal. And in that healing he rediscovered the parts of himself that had been buried beneath the weight of fame. His son's passing had brought pain, but it also brought a renewed sense of gratitude for the family and life he still had. One night, as Dean sat alone in his study, he found himself reflecting on everything that had happened since his son's death. The media frenzy, the public response, the moments of weakness and strength. It all seemed so surreal. But as the night drew on, a sense of clarity washed over him. Grief had no timeline. It wasn't something that could be boxed up and put away. It was something that had to be lived through day by day. And in that living, there was a quiet power. Dean knew he would never be the same, but he also realized that he didn't need to be. His grief, his journey, had become part of his legacy. And in a way, it had brought him closer to the people he loved. He didn't need to be the man the world expected him to be. He just needed to be the father, the husband, the man who had loved deeply and lost. In the end, that was all that mattered. The days turned into weeks, and slowly, Dean began to find moments of peace. Though the grief never fully left him, he started to embrace it as part of his journey. His family noticed the changes. His relationship with Jean grew stronger, and together they began to heal. He found solace in small, everyday moments. Quiet dinners, walks in the garden, and late-night talks about their past. There was no rushing this process. Dean knew he had to take things at his own pace. He allowed himself to feel the pain, but he didn't let it define him. In those moments, the loss of his son became a part of him, shaping him into a more grounded, empathetic man. His laughter still rang out, but now there was a depth to it, a richness that came from having faced the darkest moments of his life and finding a way through them. He had always been the entertainer, the star, but now there was an authenticity to him that was impossible to ignore. In private, Dean would often sit with his thoughts, reflecting on the life he had lived and the legacy he had built. He would remember his son, the dreams they had shared, and the love they had both tried to express in their own way. Dean Jr.'s death had taken a piece of him, but it had also given him a renewed sense of purpose. Dean wanted to honor his son's memory in everything he did from that point on. He began to donate to causes that were important to his son, setting up scholarships, and speaking at events that brought attention to the things his son had cared about. In doing so, Dean found a sense of closure. He understood that although his son was gone, the love they shared was eternal, and that love would continue to shape the work he did in the future. It wasn't about forgetting. It was about living in a way that would make his son proud. As the years passed, Dean's grief became a quiet companion, always there, but no longer the overwhelming force it had once been. Harry still thought of his son often, especially in the moments when life seemed most fragile. But with time, the pain became more manageable, more integrated into the story of his life. Dean found a new balance. His career continued, but now it was different. It was no longer driven by the need to impress or maintain an image, but by a desire to leave a meaningful legacy. He began to speak openly about the challenges of grief, using his platform to help others understand that even the strongest individuals could break, and that it was okay to feel. His vulnerability became a powerful message for his fans and peers alike. He was still Dean Martin, a legend, but now he was also a man who had known the deepest loss and found a way to keep going. Dean Martin's story spread far beyond the world of entertainment. His response to his son's death became a symbol of quiet strength and grace in the face of tragedy. His legacy wasn't just built on his music, but on the lessons he taught through his actions. He showed the world that even the greatest of us are human, that grief doesn't make us weaker, it makes us more compassionate. The legend of Dean Martin would live on not just through the songs he sang, but through the way he handled the hardest moment of his life. His story was one of redemption, of finding strength in vulnerability, and of never letting go of the love that shapes us. Dean's life, though filled with fame and fortune, was also a testament to the power of love and the importance of family. And in that, his true legacy was secured. Dean Martin's story is one of heartbreak, resilience, and quiet dignity. His journey through grief shows us that even legends are human, and that the true measure of strength lies in how we face our darkest moments. What do you think of Dean's response? Let's know in the comments. Don't forget to like and subscribe for more emotional stories.